Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Does your child have a diagnosis of ADHD? Are they fidgety? Do they have sensory processing disorder? Possibly dysgraphia, just general ants in their pants. Maybe they don't have a diagnosis, but they just always seem like they're constantly on the move. If that's the case, then you'll want to really tune in and listen to what I have to say today. So this reflex that I want to talk about today is really important because it is so often the reason why kids can't sit still. And it's like insane to me that we are medicating before we are looking at these, neurological weaknesses, these weak connections in the lower brain levels, that when we address this root cause, so to speak, all of a sudden things get infinitely better. I had a client several years ago who was exactly that kid, could not sit still at the dinner table, could not sit still in class. It was bright, but just seemed to be constantly moving. And once we started working on this reflex, strengthening his core, doing all the things that need to be done in order to get everything working properly on a lower brain level, then all of a sudden he was sitting in class. His parents couldn't believe he could sit through an entire dinner and wasn't sitting and moving and falling out of his chair and so forth. So this kid basically he was described sometimes as it was like he was just constantly vibrating. Like he had sensory processing disorder, he had dysgraphia. Obviously, he was on his way. He had been diagnosed with ADHD. Mom was doing everything in her power to not put him on medication. They really didn't want to do that. But she was getting really discouraged because they already had a pretty healthy diet. She had done some tweaks on her own, felt like there was maybe some improvement, but ultimately he just seemed really wired all the time. And so when she came to see me, we screened him and found out that he has something called a retained spinal galant reflex. And so the spinal galant reflex, again, very crucial in utero and during infancy. It is actually one of the first things it does. Again, like the one I talked about earlier this week, the ATNR, it helps the baby to move through the birth canal. It also assists with gross motor coordination. It assists with what is known as homolateral movements, so one-sided movements. Before our children can start doing cross-lateral, such as walking and crawling and so forth, they first start with just one-sided movements because the two hemispheres of the brain are not talking very well together at that point. And so what it does is it helps to not only prepare the baby for walking and movement, it helps to develop the inner ear. And if you've been following me in the last few weeks, even months, I've been talking a lot about the inner ear and the vestibular function and so forth. And the inner ear is really connected with vestibular function. And it's not only necessary for things like creeping and crawling and so forth, it's also crucial for kids to just, if their vestibular system is off, it's going to look like they have this internal motor that is always on. And so the spinal galant reflex usually in these cases is retained and is now causing problems because it hasn't integrated into the nervous system. So keeping in mind the inner ear is not just vestibular system, it does so much, right? Obviously it's connected to hearing, but it's also connected to things like auditory processing, which is different than just hearing. And so many of our kids with ADHD, dyslexia, learning disabilities, and so forth have poor auditory processing. And so if we want to improve phonemic awareness, if we want to improve their ability to follow instructions or to remember instructions, right, then we need to address this inner ear. We need to address things like the spinal galant reflex if we want them to sit still in class. So the spinal galant should disappear by 9 months. If it does not, that's where we're going to start seeing challenges, maybe not right away, but as things go on, especially when by the time kids hit school, it becomes really obvious where they're going to start we're going to start seeing problems with possibly learning, behavior, self-regulation. Like I said, these are the kids who get the diagnosis of being hyperactive, not just poor focus, but hyperactive. So the research has found that a large amount of children with ADHD do have a retained spinal galant reflex. And I spoke before about it was found that all children in this one particular study, it was a massive study, it was kind of a groundbreaking study. They've done ones before, but this one was ones from all across different socioeconomic backgrounds and so forth across the country in the US, and they found that all of these children with learning and behavioral difficulties had retained primitive reflexes, which is what I have been talking about the last few days. So I mentioned creeping and crawling and movement and so forth and gross motor skills. Let me know whether you're watching the live or the replay. Did your child crawl? Did they crawl for long enough? Were they an early walker? Does anything stand out with that? And maybe it doesn't, and it doesn't mean that if they did all this great that it isn't retained. But one thing that I have noticed in my clinic is that a huge percentage of my clients had some kind of discrepancy with those milestones, whether it's crawling, for a very short time, not really doing a full crawl, and all of that is really important for brain function. I am going to be talking more about this in my web class. If you haven't signed up, I urge you to do that before spots fill up. That's this Saturday, February 27th, where I'll be talking all about root causes and so forth. So the research has found that so many of these kids with ADHD have a retained spinal galant reflex. And reason number one is that, so they're constantly fidgeting, right? Because what happens is they tend to become really sensitive around the waist. And that's my daughter, this reflex is retained in her. And exactly what happens, the teacher said, like, she just can't stop moving all the time. And of course, she had sensory processing disorder and so forth. And so it's one thing that will affect their ability to focus and concentrate is it feels like there's something constantly irritating their waist. And it might not always feel like my waist feels irritated, but there's always this overstimulation. And so they're trying to manage it by moving. And it makes it very difficult then for them to concentrate and focus in class because of this constant irritation, because they just feel the need to be moved because this reflex is active. So I just want to stress that they might not be aware of an irritation. So you could say to your child, do you feel like something's irritating your waist? And they might say no, because it goes much further than that, which is into the second thing I want to mention, and that is poor vestibular function. So when the spinal galant is retained, vestibular function is weak. And as I've talked about before, if you've seen my videos on vestibular function, check them out on my Facebook page or YouTube. And what happens is, if you've been in yoga class, you know this. It is easier to balance when you are moving than when you are standing perfectly still, right? Sometimes to catch our balance, we move a little and we're like, whoa, and then we are able to catch our balance. And so what these kids are doing is their vestibular system is weak because of this retained spinal galant, because of other things likely as well. Usually it's not just one reflex. And so they have to constantly be moving in order to be able to function. And therefore, when they are constantly moving, they are basically not able to focus on the lesson. They're not able to retain properly. So this can actually start presenting as learning difficulties. So more so than just ADHD, it can look like they have poor short-term memory or poor memory in general, and they're not, getting the information they need to get to be able to do the work, and then they're totally lost. And it just looks like total breakdown, when really what they're doing is they're moving in order to be able to concentrate. And so if they have to sit still, their cortex is compensating for these weak lower brain levels. So if they have to sit still, then what's happening is they are using their cortex to sit still. It's their cortex isn't free to fully retain, to fully learn, to fully be able to do all the things that they want to do. So let me know if any of this sounds familiar, if this resonates, if this is like an aha moment in the comments. And again, I'll be talking more in detail about all of this type of stuff in my web class on Saturday. And then another thing that we often see with these kids is that they're more prone to clumsiness, particularly the lower half, because the spinal galant affects sort of the lower half of the spine and the trunk with reference to the body. So they're more prone to like tripping. Some of these kids, if it's really severely retained, might have an awkward well. They might have poor posture. They might have dysgraphia or poor handwriting, or just poor fine or even gross motor skills in general. They tend to be hypersensitive. So I mentioned sensory processing disorder. So it could be hypersensitive, particularly around the waist, to certain textures and clothing and belts and jeans and so forth. But it goes much further than that. It can be like food, textures, picky eating, all of that type of stuff. And then even further than that is this reflex can affect digestion. So these kids are more prone to digestive issues. And other little quirks is these are the kids where they might prefer to do their work lying down, like either on their back or on their belly. They might just or just work in weird ways. Like they're not the kid who's sitting at the kitchen table or their desk. They want to have their body placed in a way because this sitting up like this feels quite awkward and uncomfortable and distracting, to be perfectly honest. They also tend to prefer loose-fitting clothes around the waist if it's severely retained. My daughter was like that for the longest time. And they might have challenges with things like verbal or written instructions because that auditory processing has been affected because of the inner ear. And so you might be wondering, wow, like, is there some kind of way of knowing? So I'm going to give you one easy way to test right now that you can do this at home today. And I will have more clear instructions at the masterclass on Saturday. If you can join me there, you will get actually a whole freebie on a free screening and so forth that allows you to check your child to see what reflexes are retained and so forth. So what you want to do is get your child on all fours, like they're kind of getting ready to do the yoga pose cat-cow, but their back is flat, just regular all fours, not curling their back, relaxing, have them take a few deep breaths, relax the spine. Then what you're going to do is you're going to lift the back of their shirt because you have to be able to stroke one side of their spine and the other side of their spine on their bare skin to get the best result or to screen properly. So that's exactly what you're going to do. They're on all fours. You're just going to run your finger down the side of their spine, so one side of their spine. And then you're going to run your finger down the other side of the spine. And what you're looking for is, does your child, when you're stroking, say down the right side of their spine, do they wriggle? Do they twitch? Does their arm go up? Maybe some kids it's quite ticklish. If the reflex is retained, there will be a reaction. Don't tell them this, especially just don't tell them what you're looking for. Just say you want to try something. Because especially as they get older, they can sometimes get better at resisting it. And again, this is not a hard and fast rule. It doesn't mean if they don't wriggle that it's definitely not retained, but it's definitely a really good screening place to start. So you want to just check that. And if you get a reaction, most likely the spinal galant is retained. And my daughter always had a reaction for the longest time and we kept working on it. Now there's no reaction. And now she's thriving and has none of these issues that were always just such a frustration and even at certain points a complete nightmare. So once again, join me Saturday for the masterclass. I will be talking all about root causes, the 3 secrets I use in my program to help kids with learning and behavioral difficulties that go way beyond the limitations of IEPs, medication, tutoring, all of those conventional approaches, which totally have a place and can be helpful, but are ultimately Band-Aid or compensations. I'm really passionate about corrective strategies, and I want to say more than strategies, corrective solutions. Knowing what I see in my clinic, what I see with what I experienced with my own daughter's incredible healing and so forth. So thanks for watching. I will post the link to sign up if you haven't done that already in the comments below. Let me know, does this sound like your child? Does this sound like they could have a retained spinal galant reflex? Do the test. Let me know how it goes. I'm always really curious. It's always super interesting to have these aha moments and so forth. So thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.